The Lancashire witch trials of 1612 are among the most famous in English history and some of the best recorded in the 17th century. The majority of the witches on trial were from Pendle Hill in the northwest of England. The rest included the Salisbury cannibals, Janet Briley, Jane Southworth and Ellen Browley, as well as Margaret Pearson, the Padiham witch, and Isabel Roby from Windle. 70 years later, at the other end of the country, was the trial of Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles and Susanna Edwards. The three were from the town of Bideford in Devon, where Mary and Susanna were blamed for causing a woman's illness. Temperance Lloyd was accused of conversing with the devil while he was in the form of a magpie, and multiple witnesses even claimed to have seen him feeding off her inch-long teats. She also confessed to cursing a woman's knee to bleed by pricking a piece of leather 9 times. The Bideford witches were the last recorded women to be hanged in England for the crimes of witchcraft. These are all just examples of some of the better-known British witches in history. However, there is one woman who has since slipped into obscurity: the Witch of Kelsall. Who was Alice Cawley? Aside from a passing reference to her being a witch in The Little Book of Cheshire by Roger Stevens, and a brief mention in the 1987 book The Story of Kelsall by historian Elspeth Thomas, there is very little mention of Alice Cawley in print. Author Beatrice Tunstall's 1931 novel, The Shiny Night, features a witch living in the forest near Edisbury Hill, which is the other side of Pale Heights to Kelsall Hill in Delamere Forest. Even though it was only fiction, Beatrice Tunstall was a keen historian. Could it be inspired by the local stories of Alice Cawley? I decided to delve deeper and look into the actual public records, birth records, church marriage registers and genealogical documents to see if I could uncover the truth behind who Alice Cawley really was. Okay, the only place I could find any trace of a Cawley family from Kelsall Hill was in an archive document from 1879, which is available from the Indiana Public Records Office in America. It's a list of various records relating to England, specifically Lancashire and Cheshire, and this one lists a few members of the Cawley family from Kelsall Hill throughout the centuries, but none of them directly referencing Alice. So the question we need to answer now is, where exactly is Kelsall Hill? Delamere Forest covers over 2,000 acres of woodland. Delamere means Forest of the Lakes due to the amount of lakes in the area. In medieval times it was known as the Great Forest of Mara and Mondrum, which originally covered over 60 square miles of Cheshire and were established in the 11th century as the hunting forest of the Norman Earls of Chester. Okay, now up there is, that's the side of Old Pale, the bit at the top where the towers are, that's Pale Heights. Just to the left you see that ridge of the hill, that part's called Edisbury Hill, and along there is Edisbury Hill Fort, which was one of the biggest Roman hill forts that dates back to the Iron Age, actually. But we're going to be going up this track to the top of Pale Heights, where our journey will begin. Okay, I'm now at the foot of Old Pale Hill. As you can see, there's a car park, field and picnic area behind me. On that land that used to be a farm called Old Pale Farm, and that's where the area gets its name from.
I am informed on good authority that there is another farm called New Pale Farm that still exists on the west side of the hill. But the old Pale Farm got knocked down, I don't know how long ago. Okay, let's see how fit I am. I think I'm about halfway up the hill now. If you look behind me, there is a stunning view of Cheshire. At the top of Pale Heights there's a load of transmitter towers for TV, radio, telephone and a trigonometrical point. There's also a load of decorative stones that were erected in the early part of the 21st century that show the different counties of Derbyshire, Lancashire, Cheshire, Shropshire and Staffordshire. So we'll have a good look at those when we're at the top before we descend down the west side of the hill into Nettleford Wood. Okay, you can clearly see all the transmitter towers now. Very, very near the top. You can just see the first of the county stones behind me. I'm just going to climb up to the top, so... Pretty fascinating actually. Each of the county stones was made using a stone that represented that county. And at the very centre is a commemorative plaque with the history of the place. 2009 is when all these stones were erected. So it's not pretty old, but timeless. Okay, now I'm at the top. I need to make my way down again. I'm going to descend the summit down the west side in that little area of trees there. That part of Delamere Forest is known as Nettleford Wood, and that's on the border of the area known as Kelsall Hill. Jump down. Whee! Past all the transmitter towers. You can see these for miles, you know. Going downhill is so much easier than going up a hill. Worryingly, I've hit a crossroads and there is no sign. I need to look for part of the trail that's known as the Sandstone Trail that goes all the way to Frodsham, but I'm not going that way. On the map, it was literally west, not west. Yeah, it was literally west as soon as you pass the tower. I've just passed the tower, so I'm assuming it's that way. If you never hear from me again, I've got lost in Delamere Forest. I'm sticking with my gut and going down this path, even though there was no signs and it's looking like, I don't know though. Could be the right way. Now, I do believe I was on the right track. See, Nathan Head, you should always trust your instinct. There's a sign, let's see what it says. Yes, it's the Sandstone Trail. Now, if we go north on the Sandstone Trail for about 6 or 7 miles, we end up in the town of Frodsham. If we go south, it's Kelsall Hill. It's a very peaceful part of the forest. I've just noticed this. I don't know how old this is. There's one of those substation things. Evidence that there were houses, or a house at least along here. I don't know how old they were. When were they installed in England? I don't know. Whether there was a house in this part of the woods or not. Clearly something here. Probably just a brick wall that was dividing farmland, because you see that a lot in the countryside, but there's clearly no farmland here now. It's all trees. These trees look rather young. I don't know when these were planted. These were probably planted by the Forestry Commission. In fact, I think very little of the trees in this part of the wood are the original trees. They get knocked down to make footpaths and new ones get planted. It's difficult to imagine what it would have been like walking through this woodland in Alice Cawley's time. What you have to remember is a lot of these footpaths were only built in the 1980s, once the Forestry Commission got hold of the forest, and a lot of the roads were only tarmacked in the early 20th century once they built the train line through to connect to the houses. So in the 19th century, there was no roads, no paths, it would have just been dense woodland. There was a coach house, which is now a pub, the Vale Royal Abbey Arms, which was on Chester Road, an ancient Roman road that was through the forest. So in Alice Cawley's time, you have to try and picture. You'd have to get to know the land, or you'd get lost very, very easily. Decided to have a rest on a log in the woodland, Nettleford Wood. I was reading some of the stories of Alice Cawley, and even though she was a witch, she wasn't hated locally. You have to remember that witchcraft was legal now. Well, it's not that it was legal, it was that they'd stopped persecuting women for the crimes of witchcraft. And she was known as a local wise woman, a local medicine woman. One interesting thing about her, though, that is on a few written records, she kept a toad, and she slept with it above her bedsheets. I don't know whether that's her familiar, or perhaps it was just a toad that she'd gathered in the forest, because toads were used for flying ointments. I'm sure I heard a noise then. Right, I think I'm going to carry on. It's believed that witches would keep a pet with them at all times, which was known as a witch's familiar. It was an imp, goblin or demon in the form of an animal that would assist the witch in their spells. It's also said in a famous book that was written as a guide to help people hunt witches and persecute them, the Malleus Maleficarum, that witches used toads in order to make their flying ointment. So, without further evidence, I can't exactly presume what Alice kept a pet toad for. There's another crossroads. I'm certain we carry straight on here. This part of Nettleford Wood is quite open, so it's easier to see where you're going. Still not convinced I took the right turning at that last crossroads, but on a map it is a straight line once you get on that trail, so I'm hoping in a straight line. Speaking of which, here we are at yet another crossroad in the wood. Let's see what this sign says. Stony Lane is that way. Kelsall is that way. Delamere Forest is that way, where I've just come from. Gresty's Waste is that way. So it's this way. Now Gresty's Waste is actually named after the guy that used to own the toll house, Mr. Gresty. You can probably hear traffic now. We are at the edge of the wood, coming up to Chester Road, which is the main road. It's an ancient road built by the Romans that links the town of Chester, the city of Chester rather, with the nearby town of Northwich. Famous for its salt mines. So the Romans built this road connecting the two, which is now a very, 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 very busy road with lots of cars. Of course there weren't cars in Roman times. in October 1986, they cut into the Kelsall Hill to extend the A54 bypass as part of a £3 million expansion project.
Even though the hillside where she once lived had long since been dug out to make way for an A road, I feel I now had a good idea of the general surroundings that Alice Cawley resided in during her lifetime. But what did it mean to be a witch in the 19th century? In order to understand the day-to-day activities of a witch, I travelled 8 miles west of Kelsall Hill to the nearby city of Chester to meet up with a 21st century witch.
Witchcraft is incorporated into my life in so many different ways. It's twined into my day-to-day. The most basic thing that I have is at home I've got an altar where I've set up kind of all my different tools and all the things that I use to practice. They're just there as a focal point, as a place for me to focus my energies when I want to study or practice or do anything. On a day-to-day basis, I would do a shower ritual in the morning, so that's just visualizing that the water is cleansing away any negativity from the day before and refreshing yourself for the day to come. And then if I was to clean the house, I would sweep with a broom so that would sweep away any of the negativity. It's less of a physical way of kind of sweeping dust and more of a way of sweeping the energies out of the room. You have to do it a certain way and maybe do a chant or a spell as you're doing it. Obviously I have cauldrons in my house and I like to play with herbs and different kind of tinctures and such. And apart from that, it's just whether I feel like doing a spell or a ritual on the day.
Good or evil spells?
Ooh,
or is there no such thing?
So there's this huge misconception with witches. I hear the question a lot, so are you a white witch? And I think there's this kind of idea these days that if you're not a white witch, then you must be evil, you must be bad. And that's just not true, because the concept of a white witch is actually quite modern, it's quite strange, and a lot of witches scoff at the idea of white witchcraft because nature doesn't work in good versus evil, nothing is black and white, and we focus very much on a divinity and a love for nature. And so if nature doesn't work in very specific black and white, good, bad, then neither should witches, we don't believe, because we work with the intrinsic forces of the natural world. Sometimes I might do a spell that is a blessing, but you know, it depends on the context. For example, if I'm blessing you to avoid negative people, to you that's a good thing, but to the negative people that might be considered bad. And there's a quote that I live by, and that is, a witch who can't curse can't heal either. All my life I've been surrounded by people who call themselves witches or pagans, and I grew up on the Isle of Anglesey. So I was surrounded by mythology, magic, things like that, and my grandmother actually called herself a witch, but I always kind of assumed that was all just a game or a make-believe. Didn't think much of it until I was about 12, and I started reading into it, started studying into it, so technically I've been a witch since I was about 12, 13.
Has the actual practice of being a witch changed much? I mean, you watch a lot of documentaries and read a lot of books and you see like, well, they're all in pointy hats, cursing cow's milk to go sour. Has a lot of the practicing changed? I mean, do you still do things like have a witch's familiar or anything like that?
So a lot of the tropes that we have from the 1600s about witches, some of them have some kind of basis in reality. So witches' familiars, in the past they were considered to be demons or goblins that took the form of an animal, whereas these days most witches have a pet that they use as a familiar. A familiar and a pet are very different things.
Yeah.
A familiar will actively work with you and engage with you when you're practicing magic or when you're doing your rituals, whereas a pet usually won't.
So you mentioned before that you've got an altar with many tools and trinkets on it. How easy was it for you as a witch in the 21st century to get hold of those?
It was very easy to find tools. If you go onto any website such as eBay, Etsy, Amazon, and you type in witchcraft, you'll find cauldrons, you'll find chalices, you'll find athameas and daggers and wands and all sorts. It's all very there, it's very easily found, and it's also very mass-produced as well. There's a lot of mass-produced kind of tat about that. When I was starting out was all that I could find, so I would dive into it. Now that I've kind of grown, I've decided to delve into kind of more traditional tools.
Nowadays you can go online, order it, and they'll be there within the next day.
Yeah, definitely. And any major city these days has at least one shop that deals in the metaphysical and new age kind of things. We've got about 4 here in Chester. You can buy tarot cards, Ouija boards, anything like that. So finding tools nowadays, very easy. And even if you don't want to use the mass-produced stuff, and you want to use simple things such as cast iron cauldrons or poiky pots or anything like that, then you can find them as well just by doing a quick Google.
And how about when you're first becoming a witch? I imagine hundreds of years ago you probably got to be part of a coven and they teach you the ways, or you've got to be passed down a book of instructions. Nowadays you can just go on a website and print it off or order a book. Was that easier? Because you say you became a witch at a very young age, but you started practicing witchcraft probably later on. How did you come into it? Was it a website? Did you find a book? Did you have a friend that introduced you?
So I started out by... I found a book in a charity shop.
Yeah?
It was called Spells for Teenage Witches, which looking back at it, I cringe a little. But I still have the book. It's just a little yellow book. And back then, I thought nothing of it. I thought, it must be something to do with Harry Potter. It must be fiction. Let me have a leaf through it, see what it's about. And looking back at it now, I can see that it actually is a guide for pagan witches. It's a guide on how to cast your own spells, on how to draw your own circle, how to draw down the moon, how to work with the energies of nature. But back then I was completely fascinated by it. And of course, because I grew up in the age of the internet coming into being, I started Googling all sorts of things, and there was all sorts of websites about spells for witches and how to do these things, and of course YouTube videos and such as well. So it was so easy for me to just kind of get online, start getting the information, and it's just getting easier and easier as time goes on.
With the storm getting heavier over Chester, I decided it was time to wrap up our visit with Mara for today. But before I start my journey home, I asked Mara for her views on Alice Cawley's toad, and she came up with an alternative theory to its presence.
Shapeshifting in witchcraft is a huge trope that we see a lot, and within actual witchcraft folklore there's a lot of talk about witches not only having familiars and keeping animals as pets, but also being able to ride as an animal. So riding from original folklore is when a witch would transform herself either physically, as in they would actually transform their physical body into an animal, or they would transfer their soul in the form of astral projection and such into the body of an animal, and they would ride that animal around. And of course, being able to transform into these creatures was seen as like a very witchy and demonic thing. There's stories all over England of hares, for example, that are running through the countryside and they get shot by a farmer or a hunter, and then down the road a woman inexplicably runs out of her house with a gunshot wound on her body.
And it's possible that she was riding the hare when
riding the hare, so she receives the wound of the gunshot. And so that was one way that people used to point out witches and say, that's a witch because she turned into a hare. And of course there's the numerous stories of witches being able to transform other people into creatures as well.
Now, the possibility that Alice Cawley's toad may have been another person riding an actual toad got me thinking about other explanations, which then led me to a rather curious discovery.
It's Halloween! It's story time with the jumping jelly beans. I'm Sean B., the Witch of Kuala Lumpur. Today we have Warlock Johnny Gillett with us, and he has 3 spooky tales. Listen to our first tale, to what happens to a young man who interrupts the bedtime of an old lady, Alice Cawley, one stormy night many years ago. Here's Johnny with the Witch of Kelsall.
Storytime with the Jumping Jellybees is a storytelling podcast from Kuala Lumpur, but it features stories from all over the world. And episode 26 was a special Halloween episode that featured 3 short folk tales. One of which was an adaptation of the tale of Alice Cawley, and how she used magic to transform a woodland traveller into that toad that she kept in her bed.
They say he's still hopping along, trying to find his way. So if you see a toad, well, don't tell him to hop off. Be kind to him. And maybe, perhaps you could take him home to look after him. Or perhaps it's best just to leave him. I'm not sure how he'd be happier. Either way, I'm sure he wishes that he'd never knocked on that door and shouted to Alice Cawley, the Witch of Kelsall.